The chalk dust hung in the afternoon sunlight, like tiny stars suspended in time. Margaret Kozlowski stood at the front of her classroom in the small town of Oswiecim, Poland, a place the world would soon know by its German name, Auschwitz. But on this September afternoon in 1939, it was still just home. Margaret was 28 years old. With dark hair, she wore pinned back in a practical bun, and hands that were always dusted with chalk no matter how many times she washed them. She taught mathematics and literature to children between the ages of 8 and 14, and she loved every exhausting, chaotic, beautiful moment of it. Miss Kozlowski. A small hand shot up from the third row. It belonged to Jacob, a 10-year-old boy with glasses that were always sliding down his nose. If we're learning about fractions, does that mean we can have fractional holidays? Like half of tomorrow off? The classroom erupted in giggles. Margaret tried to maintain her stern teacher expression, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her. Nice try, Jacob, but I think your understanding of practical applications needs some work. She turned back to the blackboard, writing out another equation when she heard it. At first, it was distant, a sound like thunder rolling across a summer sky. But this wasn't summer, and that wasn't thunder. The children heard it too, one by one. Their chatter died away until the classroom was silent, except for that growing rumble. Margaret's chalk hovered above the board, frozen mid-equation. Her heart knew what that sound was before her mind could accept it. Miss Kozlowski? This time it was Sarah, a 12-year-old girl with braids, so long they reached her waist. Her voice was small, frightened. What is that sound? Before Margaret could answer, the windows rattled in their frames. The sound was no longer distant. It was here, directly above them, a mechanical roar that made the very air vibrate. Margaret dropped her chalk and ran to the window. The sky was black with them. Airplanes, German Luftwaffe bombers, flying in formation like a flock of metal predators. She had read about the invasion in hushed conversations at the market, had heard the warnings on the radio that morning. But reading about war and watching it arrive above your classroom were two completely different things. Everyone under your desks. Now! Margaret's voice cut through the paralysis of fear. She had never used that tone before, and it shocked the children into immediate action. They scrambled under their wooden desks, their eyes wide, some already crying. Margaret moved through the rows, checking each child, her teacher's instinct overriding her own terror. She touched shoulders, whispered reassurances, projected a calm she absolutely did not feel. Under Sarah's desk, she crouched down to look the girl in the eyes. "It's going to be all right," Margaret said, and she prayed to God she wasn't lying. "Just stay here, stay quiet, and everything will be—" The explosion cut off her words. It came from somewhere across town, but it was close enough to make the building shudder. Plaster dust fell from the ceiling like snow. A little boy named Tomasz started to scream, and then they were all screaming, and Margaret was moving from desk to desk, trying to hold them all together with nothing but her voice and her presence. That afternoon lasted an eternity. Margaret stayed with her students until the bombing stopped, until parents began arriving, some running, some limping, all terrified. She matched each child with their family, watching them disappear into a world that had fundamentally changed in the space of a few hours. Jacob's mother arrived with blood on her dress. Not her own, she explained, from a neighbor who had been hit by shrapnel. Sarah's father came with tears streaming down his face, clutching his daughter like she might disappear if he let go. One by one, the children left until only 3 remained. 2 brothers named Powell and Merrick, and a small girl named Zofia. Margaret waited with them as the sun set, and the sound of distant explosions became almost routine. She told them stories, sang songs her own mother had taught her, and kept checking the door for parents who were taking too long to arrive. When Powell and Mark's uncle finally came at nearly midnight, he looked like he had aged 10 years. Their parents... He began, then shook his head, unable to finish. Margaret understood. She hugged both boys tightly and watched them leave into the darkness. Zofia's mother never came. Margaret waited until dawn, this small 6-year-old girl sleeping in her lap, before she understood that no one was coming. She later learned that Zofia's entire family had been killed when a bomb hit their apartment building. Margaret carried Sophia home to her own small apartment above a bakery. She laid the sleeping child in her own bed and sat by the window, watching the sun rise over a town that looked the same but would never be the same again. That was the last normal day of Margaret Kozlowski's life. Everything that came after, the occupation, the starvation, the resistance, the explosions that would shake the Nazi war machine, all of it began in that classroom, with chalk dust in the sunlight and the sound of thunder that wasn't thunder. She didn't know it yet, but in 3 years' time, the Nazis would have a name for her. They would call her Die Geist, the ghost. They would hunt her through the streets. She had walked her entire life. They would execute 12 people trying to find her. But on that morning, watching the sun rise over occupied Poland, she was just a teacher who had failed to get one student home. She was just Margaret, 28 years old, with no training in warfare or sabotage or any of the things she would be forced to become. She looked at Sophia sleeping in her bed, this tiny orphan girl, and made a promise that would define everything that followed. No more children would go hungry. No more children would lose their families. Whatever it took, whatever she had to become, she would protect them. Margaret didn't know that promises made in wartime become weapons. She didn't know that feeding hungry children and blowing up ammunition trucks will become the same sacred mission. She didn't know that maternal love could be the most dangerous force in occupied Europe. But she would learn. God help the Nazis. She would learn. The Nazi occupation of Auschwitz came in waves, like a sickness that gets progressively worse. At first, it was almost polite. Soldiers asking for directions, requisitioning buildings with official papers, establishing order with German efficiency. But politeness is always a mask that tyrants wear before they show their true face. Margaret returned to her classroom 2 weeks after the invasion, hoping that routine might restore some sense of normalcy for children. The school had survived the bombing with only a few broken windows, but everything else was different. The portrait of Marshal Pilsudski that had hung above the blackboard was gone, replaced with a picture of Hitler. The Polish flag no longer hung in the hallway. Even the textbooks were being replaced, German language and history books arriving in crates, while Polish literature and culture were literally thrown into the street. You will teach from the approved curriculum, the new German administrator informed Margaret. His name was Hauptsturmfer Werner Koch, an SS officer with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. He handed her a manual written entirely in German. The children must learn to be productive members of the Reich. Education will focus on practical skills and German language acquisition. Margaret opened the manual. Inside were lessons on racial science, German superiority, and the proper way to address German officers. There was nothing about mathematics beyond basic arithmetic. Nothing about literature, art, or music. Nothing that would teach children to think, only to obey. And if I refuse? Margaret asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said aloud. Koch's smile widened slightly. Then you will not be teaching. And neither will anyone else in this school, because we will close it permanently. These children will work in the factories instead. Is that what you want, Fräulein Kozlowski? It wasn't a question. It was the first of many impossible choices Margaret would face under occupation. Collaborate or watch everything burn. She taught from the manual. She hated every word that came out of her mouth, but she taught. And she watched her students, bright, curious children who asked questions about everything, slowly stop raising their hands. The light of curiosity in their eyes began to dim, replaced by something that looked like the careful blankness of people who had learned that asking questions was dangerous. But Margaret was learning too. She was learning to teach 2 curriculums, the one the Nazis demanded during the day, and the real one in whispered conversations during recess, in books hidden in coat pockets, in mathematics problems that secretly taught logic and critical thinking despite the approved curriculum's attempts to destroy both. Miss Kozlowski, Jacob whispered to her one afternoon, why do we have to say that German culture is better than Polish culture? My grandmother tells me Polish stories that are much better than the ones in these new books. Margaret glanced around to make sure no one was listening. The Nazis had begun placing informants everywhere, even among children, though she prayed none of her students would betray her. She crouched down beside Jacob's desk. Because sometimes, she said carefully, we have to say things we don't believe in order to survive. But saying something doesn't make it true. In your heart, you know what's real. Your grandmother's stories are real. Our history is real. Don't ever forget that, no matter what words come out of your mouth. Jacob nodded, his young face suddenly looking much older than 10 years. That was what occupation did to children. It stole their childhood one day at a time until they were tiny adults carrying burdens no child should bear. The food shortages began in November. The Nazis implemented a rationing system that was designed not to feed the Polish population, but to slowly starve them. Jews received the smallest rations, barely enough to survive. Ethnic Poles received only slightly more. Germans, of course, ate well. Margaret noticed a change in her students almost immediately. Children who had once fidgeted and whispered now sat still, conserving energy. They no longer played during recess, but huddled against the building, too tired to run. Their faces became thinner, their eyes more hollow. Zofia, who still lived with Margaret, was luckier than most. Margaret gave the little girl most of her own rations, go to bed hungry night after night, but telling herself it was worth it to see Zofia smile. But Margaret couldn't feed all 32 of her students from her own rations. She could only watch them slowly waste away. One December morning, a boy named Henrik fainted during class. He simply slid from his chair onto the floor, unconscious before anyone could catch him. Margaret knelt beside him, feeling his pulse. It was weak but steady. His lips were blue. His cheeks were so sunken she could see the shape of his skull beneath his skin. "When did you last eat?" she asked when he came to. Henrik tried to smile. "Yesterday morning. Some bread. It was my little sister's birthday, so I gave her my portion at dinner. He was 12 years old, and he was starving to death because he loved his sister." Margaret helped him to a chair and gave him the apple she had brought for her own lunch. She watched him eat it so quickly, he almost choked, and something inside her broke and reformed into something harder. That night, Margaret attended a secret meeting in the basement of a church 3 blocks from her apartment. She had been invited by her neighbor, Mrs. Kaminsky, an elderly woman who ran one of the last remaining independent shops in town. Margaret had gone out of curiosity and desperation in equal measure. The basement was crowded with perhaps 20 people, teachers, shopkeepers, a doctor, a priest, and several men and women Margaret didn't recognize. They spoke in whispers, even though the church was supposedly safe. Under occupation, nowhere was truly safe. "The situation is getting worse," said a man Margaret learned was named Stefan. He was in his 40s, with a scar across his left cheek and eyes that had seen too much. "The Nazis are requisitioning food faster than we can replace it. We've managed to divert some supplies, but it's not enough. Children are dying." "Not just children," added Mrs. Kaminsky. "Old people, sick people, anyone who can't work 12 hours a day in the factories. The Nazis don't care. To them, we're disposable labor. So what do we do?" Margaret asked, "How do we fight an entire army?" Stefan looked at her, really looked at her, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that both frightened and exhilarated her. "We don't fight them directly. We can't. They have tanks and machine guns, and we have..." He gestured around the basement. "But we can resist. We can divert their supplies. We can forge documents. We can hide people. We can make it harder for them to exploit us. 1,000 small cuts until the beast bleeds out. That's treason," someone said from the back of the room. "They'll execute anyone caught helping the resistance." "They're executing people anyway," Margaret heard herself saying. "They killed Zofia's entire family for no reason except they were Polish and in the way. They're starving children in my classroom. If doing nothing means watching everyone I love die slowly, then I choose treason." The words hung in the air. Margaret couldn't believe she had said them. She, who had never broke a rule in her life, who had been a favorite student of every teacher she'd ever had. But occupation changes people. Watching children faint from hunger changes people. Stefan nodded slowly. "Then we have work for you, if you're willing. Nothing violent, not yet. We need a courier, someone who can move through the town without raising suspicion. A teacher is perfect. The Nazis don't look at women the way they look at men. They underestimate us. We can use that. And so Margaret Kozlowski, age 28 mathematics and literature teacher, became a courier for the Polish resistance. She had no training, no experience, and no idea what she was doing. But she had 32 starving students and a promise to keep. She would learn the rest as she went. And if the Nazis caught her, well, they were going to kill her eventually anyway. At least this way, she would die having fought back. The occupation had tightened around Oswiecim like a noose. But nooses, Margaret was learning, can be tools or weapons depending on who holds a rope. She intended to take hold of that rope and pull. The first time Margaret carried illegal documents hidden in her coat, she was certain everyone could see her guilt. She walked through the streets of Oswiecim with forged identity papers sewn into the lining of her winter coat, and she was convinced that every German soldier she passed could somehow sense the treason radiating from her body like heat. Her hands shook. Her breath came too quickly when a patrol stopped her to check her papers. Her real papers, not the forgeries hidden against her ribs. She was sure her voice would crack and give her away. Papers. The soldier demanded in heavily accented Polish. He was young, maybe 19, with pimples on his chin and a rifle that looked too big for his frame. Margaret handed them over with fingers that trembled slightly. The soldier examined them with exaggerated care, comparing her face to the photograph, reading every line as if searching for a reason to arrest her. Behind him, 2 more soldiers watched with the bored expression of men who had done this same routine 100 times that day. "Why are you out after curfew?" the young soldier asked. "I'm a teacher," Margaret explained, and was surprised to find her voice steady. "I was tutoring a student who's behind in his lessons. His family lives on Krakow Street. I have a letter from his mother, if you need proof." She had learned this trick from Stefan. Always have a plausible story, always have documentation to support it, and always include unnecessary details that make the lie feel true. People who are lying tend to keep their stories simple. People telling the truth ramble and offer too much information. The soldier looked at her for a long moment, then handed back her papers. "Be more careful with time. Next time you might be shot for breaking curfew." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll be home in 5 minutes. I promise." Margaret walked away at a normal pace, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. She made it 3 blocks before she had to stop and lean against a building, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The forged papers in her coat lining felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. But she had done it. She had walked past German soldiers carrying documents that could get her executed, and they had let her pass. The realization was both terrifying and intoxicating. That was the first delivery. There would be hundreds more. Over the following months, Margaret developed a routine. Twice a week, she would receive documents or small packages from Stefan. Sometimes at the church, sometimes at Mrs. Kaminsky's shop, sometimes slipped under her apartment door in the dead of night. She never asked what was in the packages. She learned quickly that the less she knew, the less she could reveal if she was ever caught and interrogated. Her role was simple: take the package from point A to point B without being caught. Sometimes she delivered to addresses across town, sometimes to farms outside Oswiecim. Once, she took a train 30 miles away to deliver a package to a monastery that was hiding Jewish families in its cellar. She learned to walk like she belonged everywhere. She learned which soldiers were lazy and which were thorough. She learned which streets had the fewest patrols and which buildings had back exits. She learned to read the mood of the occupation, like a farmer reads a sky before a storm. She also learned to lie, really lie convincingly without hesitation. When stopped by patrols, she would smile and chat about the weather, about her students, about the excellence of German organization. She would compliment their uniforms and ask after their health. She would become the most boring, harmless, forgettable person they met that day. The Germans called this type of person Grauesmaschen, little gray mouse. Someone so ordinary they disappeared into the background of daily life. Margaret became the most ordinary-looking teacher in occupied Poland. She wore plain clothes in gray and brown. She kept her head down. She never argued or drew attention. And while playing the perfect submissive Polish woman, she was stealing from them, diverting their resources, forging their documents, and making their occupation just a little bit harder every single day. But it wasn't enough. The children in her classroom continued to grow thinner. The Nazis had begun construction on something massive just outside town, a complex of buildings and barracks that everyone whispered about but no one understood yet. More Jews were disappearing from the town every week, loaded onto trains that never seemed to return. The violence was escalating. One afternoon in March 1940, Margaret was teaching a lesson on German geography, one of the approved curriculum topics, when gunshots echoed from somewhere nearby. The children froze. Margaret froze. Everyone had learned to recognize the sound of executions by now. She did what she always did. She kept teaching. She kept her voice steady and continued describing the rivers of Bavaria as if people weren't being murdered 2 streets away. She had learned that maintaining normalcy, pretending that atrocities weren't happening, was sometimes the only way to protect children from psychological collapse. But when class ended and the children had gone home, Margaret walked toward the sound of those gunshots. She didn't know why. Maybe she needed to see what she was really fighting against. Maybe she needed to make it real, instead of abstract. She found a site 2 blocks away, a wall covered in bullet holes and blood. In front of it lay 6 bodies, 4 men and 2 women, all Polish, all executed for crimes that were posted on a sign beside them. Conspiracy against the Reich. Margaret stood there staring at those bodies and realized she was looking at her own future. This was what happened to resistors when they were caught. No trial, no mercy, just a wall and bullets and a body left as a warning. She should have been terrified. She should have run home and burned the documents hidden in her apartment and vowed never to take another risk. But instead, she felt something else crystallizing inside her, resolve. The Nazis wanted her afraid. They wanted all of them afraid. Too frightened to resist, too terrorized to fight back. They wanted a population that would police itself through fear. Margaret looked at those 6 bodies and thought, "Not me. You can kill me, but you will never make me afraid enough to stop." She walked back to her apartment with her head high. That night, she attended another meeting in the church basement. And this time when Stefan asked for volunteers for a more dangerous mission, Margaret's hand went up first. "We need someone to start diverting food," Stefan explained. "The Nazis have warehouses where they store supplies before distribution. If we could get someone inside, even just to document what's there, we could plan raids. It's more dangerous than courier work. You'd be inside German facilities." "I'll do it," Margaret said without hesitation. Mrs. Kaminsky frowned. "Margaret, dear, courier work is one thing, but what Stefan is suggesting." "I'll do it," Margaret repeated. "The children in my class are starving. All the children in this town are starving. I don't care about the risk anymore. I care about keeping them alive." Stefan studied her face. "You've changed," he said quietly. "When you first came here, you were terrified. Now you're angry," Margaret finished. "I'm very, very angry, and I'd like to do something productive with that anger before it eats me alive." He smiled, a real smile this time, not the grim expression he usually wore. "Good. Anger is better fuel than fear. Fear burns fast and leaves you weak. Anger can keep you going for years." And so Margaret Kozlowski, the little gray mouse, the forgettable teacher, began to learn the layout of Nazi warehouses. She learned where they stored food, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. She learned guard rotation schedules and weak points in security. She sketched maps on paper she would immediately burn after memorizing them. The Nazis never suspected her. How could they? She was just a teacher, a woman, a nobody who smiled politely and taught their approved curriculum without complaint. They looked right through her, as if she were invisible. In German, there's a word, Geist. It means ghost, spirit, or phantom, something that cannot be caught or killed because it isn't quite real. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she was becoming exactly that. She was becoming the ghost that would haunt the Nazi occupation, appearing and disappearing, impossible to catch, leaving destruction in her wake. But ghosts are made, not born, and Margaret Kozlowski was still learning what it would cost to become one. By the summer of 1940, hunger had become the new normal in Oswiecim. It wasn't just discomfort or inconvenience. It was a physical presence that occupied every space, consumed every thought, and drained the color from the world until everything looked gray and hollow. Margaret saw it in her classroom every day. Children who could no longer concentrate because their empty stomachs hurt too much to focus. Students who fell asleep at their desks mid-lesson, their young bodies shutting down to conserve precious energy. Kids who fought over pencil shavings because they were so hungry they would put anything in their mouths just to feel like they were eating. The ration cards that were supposed to feed them were a cruel joke. The official Nazi allocation for a Polish child was 669 calories per day, barely enough to keep a body alive, let alone a growing child who needed to learn and play and develop. Jewish children received even less, 184 calories per day. It was starvation by bureaucracy, murder by mathematics. Margaret did the calculation one night, sitting at her small kitchen table with the ration card spread in front of her. At 669 calories per day, the human body would slowly consume itself, burning through fat reserves first, then muscle tissue, then finally the organs themselves. A child could survive on that for maybe 6 months before malnutrition caused irreversible damage. A year before death. The Nazis weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were killing the Polish population without firing a single shot, and they were making their victims queue up politely to collect the tools of their own destruction. Margaret crumpled the ration cards in her fist, not her students. She wouldn't let them become another statistic in the Nazi plan to empty Poland of Poles. The next day, she went to Stefan with a proposal that was either brilliant or insane. She wasn't sure which. "I want to raid the food warehouses," she told him. "Not document them, not plan for someday. I want to break in and steal food. Now, as much as we can carry." Stefan looked at her like she had suggested they fly to Berlin and punch Hitler in the face. "Margaret, warehouse raids require planning, weapons, multiple people. We're not ready for that kind of operation. The risk is that my students will be dead in 6 months," Margaret interrupted. Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking with barely controlled fury. "I watched a 7-year-old girl collapse yesterday. She was unconscious for 20 minutes. When she woke up, do you know what she said? She apologized. She apologized for causing trouble. That's what hunger does. It makes children apologize for their bodies shutting down." She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Stefan's. "I don't care about the risk anymore. I don't care if they catch me. I care that children are dying, and we're sitting in church basements making careful plans while they starve to death. So I'm going into that warehouse without your help. The only question is whether you're coming with me." Stefan was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something Margaret didn't expect. He laughed, not a happy laugh, but the kind of bitter, exhausted laugh that comes from realizing you've been outmaneuvered by a schoolteacher half your size. "You're absolutely insane," he said. "You know that, right?" "Probably," Margaret agreed. "Does that mean you're helping?" "It means I'm not letting you get killed doing something stupid alone. If we're going to commit suicide by Nazi, we might as well do it properly." They spent 3 days planning the raid. Margaret provided the warehouse layout she had memorized during her reconnaissance missions. Stefan recruited 4 others, all men who had military experience from before the war. They studied guard patterns, identified the weakest entry point, and planned 3 different escape routes. The warehouse they targeted was on the eastern edge of town, a large brick building where the Germans stored food supplies before distribution. According to Margaret's observations, it was guarded by only 2 soldiers at night. The Germans were confident enough in their control of the town that they didn't see the need for heavy security. That confidence would be their mistake. They went in on a Tuesday night, when there was no moon. Margaret dressed all in black, her hair tucked under a dark cap, her face smeared with ash to reduce reflection. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. This person who was about to commit what the Nazis would call a capital crime. Zofia was asleep in the next room. Before leaving, Margaret kissed the little girl's forehead and whispered, "If I don't come back, Mrs. Kaminsky will take care of you. You'll be safe. I promise." She meant it. Whatever happened that night, she had made arrangements. Zofia would never be alone again. The group met 2 blocks from the warehouse at midnight. Stefan handed out tools, crowbars, wire cutters, canvas bags for carrying food. No weapons, That was a rule Stefan insisted on. If they encountered guards, they would run, not fight. Dead Germans meant massive reprisals against the civilian population. A successful escape just meant a mystery the Nazis would eventually forget. They approached the warehouse from the back, where the wall bordered a narrow alley filled with garbage and shadows. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she was sure the guards would hear it. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of their shoes on cobblestones, the rustle of their clothes, even their breathing. One of Stefan's men, a thin fellow named Pyotr who had been a locksmith before the war, worked on the back door's padlock while the rest of them kept watch. Margaret crouched beside a stack of crates, her eyes on the corner where the guard patrolled. She could see the glow of their cigarettes in the darkness, hear the low murmur of their conversation. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. They all froze, waiting to see if the guards had heard. Seconds passed. A minute. The guards continued their conversation, oblivious. They slipped inside the warehouse one by one. Margaret was the last to enter, pulling the door almost closed behind her, but leaving it slightly ajar for a quick escape. The inside of the warehouse was dark, except for moonlight coming through high windows. As Margaret's eyes adjusted, she saw why Stefan had insisted on this particular target. The warehouse was full, truly full. Stacks and stacks of crates, sacks of grain piled to the ceiling, barrels of salted meat, wheels of cheese, boxes of canned goods. This was food to the German army, supplies that would feed soldiers while Polish children starved. Margaret felt rage boil up inside her, so hot it nearly made her dizzy. "Take only what we can carry," Stefan whispered, "and things that won't be immediately missed. Small packages, not entire crates." They worked quickly and silently, filling their bags with canned food, packages of crackers, dried fruit, chocolate bars meant for German soldiers. Margaret stuffed her bag until it was almost too heavy to lift, then added one more package of powdered milk that she knew would be invaluable for the youngest children. They were nearly done when they heard voices approaching. German voices, multiple soldiers, getting louder. Stefan's hand shot up in a signal. Freeze. They all stopped moving, barely breathing, pressed against the stacks of supplies like shadows. Margaret's bag was so heavy it was cutting into her shoulder, but she didn't dare adjust it. The voices came closer. The door they had come through, the one Margaret had left slightly ajar, began to open wider. "I'm telling you, I heard something," one guard was saying in German, a clicking sound like metal on metal. "You're jumping at shadows," another voice replied. "But fine, we'll check inside. It's probably just rats." Margaret's mind raced. If the guards came in with lanterns, they would see 6 people holding bags of stolen food. There was no hiding, no escape route that would involve running directly past armed soldiers. They were caught. But then something happened that Margaret would later describe as divine intervention or blind luck, depending on how cynical she was feeling that day. From somewhere across town, an explosion boomed, a loud, violent sound that rattled the warehouse windows. The guards' conversation stopped immediately. "What was that?" one of them shouted. "Did it come from the fuel depot?" "I don't know, but we need to report it. Come on." The footsteps receded rapidly, the guards running toward the explosion, and suddenly the warehouse was quiet again except for the thundering of 6 hearts that had all stopped beating at the same moment. "Out," Stefan breathed. "Now, before they come back." They didn't need to be told twice. They fled to the back door like shadows, running through alleys and back streets, their heavy bags bouncing against their backs. Margaret's lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest. But she didn't stop running until they reached the church basement where they had planned a rendezvous. They collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, and then, impossibly, they started laughing. Quiet, hysterical laughter born from relief and fear and the sheer insanity of what they had just done. Who set off that explosion? Pyotr asked when he could breathe again. Was that planned? Stefan shook his head. No idea, but whoever they are, I want to buy them a drink. They never found out who caused that convenient distraction. It might have been another resistance group. Might have been an accident at a German facility. Might have been God himself deciding to help some thieves who were stealing food for hungry children. Margaret didn't care. They had succeeded. They distributed the food the next day through a network of trusted families. Margaret kept some for her students, sneaking packages of food into their coat pockets when no one was watching, always with a whispered, "Don't tell anyone where this came from. Say you found it." The children didn't question her. They just ate with the single-minded intensity of people who didn't know when their next meal would come. And for a few days, Margaret saw something in their eyes that had been missing for months: hope. But hope in wartime is a fragile thing, because while Margaret was feeding 32 children, there were thousands more in Oswiecim who were still starving. And the massive construction project outside town was almost complete. Soon, Margaret would learn what that complex was for. And when she did, everything, the hunger, the stealing, the small act of resistance, would seem like practice for a much larger war. A war that would turn a mathematics teacher into something the Nazis would hunt with dogs and bullets and fear. In May 1940, the construction project outside Oswiecim was completed. The complex that had been growing on the outskirts of town like a cancer suddenly opened its gates, and Margaret Kozlowski learned what true evil looked like when it wore an organized, efficient face. The Germans had a name for it: concentration slaves, or Auschwitz. Auschwitz concentration camp. At first, it was supposed to be for political prisoners, Polish resistance members, intellectuals, anyone the Nazis deemed dangerous to their occupation. But Margaret, who had learned to watch and listen and piece together information like a puzzle, understood that this was just the beginning. The camp was too large for just political prisoners. The infrastructure was too extensive. The Germans were building something permanent, something that would grow. She was right, though it would take years before the full horror of Auschwitz became clear to the world. The first transport of Polish political prisoners arrived on June 14, 1940. Margaret watched from her classroom window as trucks rolled past, filled with men in striped uniforms. Her students pressed against the glass, trying to see, asking questions she couldn't answer honestly. "Where are they taking those men, Miss Kozlowski?" "To work," she said, which was technically true, but also the most enormous lie she had ever told. The Germans need workers. What she didn't say, those men would be worked to death, starved, beaten, and disposed when they could no longer be useful. The camp that had appeared on the edge of their town was a factory that turned human beings into corpses. Within weeks, the impact of the camp rippled through Oswiecim. The Nazis requisitioned even more food to feed the guards and administrative staff. Rations for Polish civilians were cut again. The hunger that had been terrible became catastrophic. But the camp also created opportunities that Margaret's resistance cell began to exploit. Because the Germans needed supplies constantly transported to Auschwitz: food, building materials, uniforms, ammunition, and that meant trucks on the roads. Trucks that could be intercepted. Supplies that could be diverted. "We need to think bigger," Stefan told the group at one of their meetings in late June. "The warehouse raids have been successful, but we're stealing crumbs while they bake loaves. The real supplies are going to that camp. If we could intercept even one transport." "How?" someone asked. "They travel with armed escorts. We can't ambush a military convoy with crowbars and stolen kitchen knives." Stefan smiled grimly. "Not with violence, no. But Margaret has been teaching me something about being underestimated. The Germans don't look at women. They don't look at teachers. They see what they expect to see. Maybe we use that." All eyes turned to Margaret. She felt the weight of their expectation and realized what Stefan was suggesting. "You want me to approach the convoys? Pretend to be what?" "A lost civilian. A teacher whose students need supplies for a special project," Stefan said. "Germans love order and proper procedure. If you had the right paperwork, the right story, you could get close enough to those trucks to figure out their schedules, their routes, maybe even what they're carrying." It was insane. It was also exactly the kind of insane that might work. 2 days later, Margaret stood at a checkpoint on the main road leading to Auschwitz, holding forged documents that identified her as a German-approved educator seeking supplies for a Hitler Youth equivalent program in the local schools. She wore her most conservative dress, her hair in a severe bun, her expression schoolmarm-stern. The guard at the checkpoint barely glanced at her papers. "You're here for what?" "Supply requisition. Margaret said in her best German, which was heavily accented but comprehensible. She had been teaching herself the language from confiscated textbooks, practicing until her mouth ached. We are starting a new program for youth education. I need to coordinate with the quartermaster about regular deliveries. The guard looked bored. Building 3. Ask for Oberfuhrer Schmidt. Next time, come earlier. We close this gate at 6. Just like that, Margaret Kozlowski walked into a Nazi administrative complex. Her heart was trying to escape through her ribcage, but her face remained calm, professional, slightly annoyed at the inconvenience of bureaucracy. She had learned that annoyed people look less suspicious than nervous ones. Building 3 was a long wooden structure filled with desks where German officers processed the endless paperwork that kept the Nazi machine running. Margaret found Oberfuhrer Schmidt, a middle-aged man with glasses and ink-stained fingers, and launched into her prepared story about needing regular deliveries of paper, pencils, and educational materials. Schmidt listened with the glazed expression of a man who had heard 1,000 similar requests that week. "You'll need to fill out Form 27B, he said, handing her a document. "Submit it to the district education office. They'll coordinate with our supply chain. Next." But while Schmidt was talking, Margaret's eyes were scanning everything she could see. Schedules posted on the wall, maps showing delivery routes, a logistics board that listed convoy departure times and destinations. She absorbed it all like a sponge, committing every detail to memory. She filled out Form 27B, using false information, of course, and left the building with her head down and her mind racing. She had just walked into the heart of Nazi logistics and walked back out with intelligence that could help the resistance intercept supplies for months. That evening, she met with Stefan and drew everything she had seen from memory. Convoy schedules, guard rotation times, which routes were heavily protected and which were vulnerable. It was intelligence bonanza. "This is incredible," Stefan breathed, studying her sketches. "With this, we can plan real operations. Not just warehouse raids, actual supply interdiction." "There's more," Margaret said. "I saw a manifest on the desk. They're expecting a large ammunition shipment next week, enough to supply the camp guards for 6 months. Stefan looked up sharply. Ammunition? Crates and crates of it. If the Germans are stockpiling that much ammunition at Auschwitz, it means they're planning to use it on prisoners, on resistors, on anyone who gets in their way. The room was silent as everyone processed this. Finally, Pyotr spoke. "So we take it. We intercept the shipment before it reaches the camp. That's not stealing food," Mrs. Kaminsky warned. "That's an act of war. If you're caught attacking a military supply convoy, they'll execute us," Margaret finished. "Just like they'll execute the prisoners in that camp. Just like they'll execute every Polish person in this town eventually if we don't fight back. The question isn't whether it's dangerous. Everything is dangerous now. The question is whether we're going to die having fought or die having submitted." She surprised herself with her own vehemence. When had she become this person? The Margaret Kozlowski who had taught fractions and poetry just a year ago would never have talked about intercepting military convoys. But that Margaret was gone, buried somewhere beneath all the hunger and death in occupied streets. This Margaret, the one who forged documents and lied to Nazi officers, and was now proposing to steal ammunition from an armed convoy. This was who the war had created. Stefan was nodding slowly. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No improvisation like the warehouse raid. We need a plan." They spent the next week planning. Margaret made 2 more trips to the administrative building, each time gathering more intelligence about the ammunition convoy's route and timing. She learned to arrive on a Thursday morning, traveling with a 4-man armed escort in a lead vehicle and 2 trucks carrying the ammunition. The convoy would take the main road from Krakow to Auschwitz, passing through a stretch of forest about 10 miles outside Oswiecim. That forest, dense with trees and far from any German garrison, was where the resistance would strike. The plan was elegantly simple. They would block the road with a felled tree, forcing the convoy to stop. While the soldiers dealt with the obstacle, the resistance members would emerge from the forest and create enough chaos to separate the guards from the trucks. Then they would drive the ammunition trucks into the forest, abandon them in a prepared hiding spot, and disappear before German reinforcements could arrive. What about the soldiers? Margaret asked. We can't just let them report what happened. Stefan's face was grim. We'll do what we have to do. I'm hoping they'll surrender when they see they're outnumbered. But if they fight... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that basement understood. This operation might require killing, and killing German soldiers would bring brutal reprisals. But they also understood that the ammunition in those trucks would be used to murder prisoners. Every bullet they stole was a life potentially saved. Margaret went home that night and looked at Zofia sleeping in the bed they shared. The little girl had gained some weight from the food Margaret had been stealing. Her cheeks had color again. She looked healthy, almost normal, if you didn't know that normal had ceased to exist. I'm going to do something very dangerous tomorrow, Margaret whispered to the sleeping child. If I don't come back, remember that I loved you. Remember that everything I did to try to make the world safer for children like you. Zofia didn't wake up, didn't hear, but Margaret felt better having said it aloud. Thursday morning arrived cold and overcast. Margaret dressed in dark clothes and sturdy boots. She told the school administrator she was sick and couldn't teach that day. Then she walked to the forest where the resistance was gathering. There were 12 of them in total. Stefan, Pyotr, Mrs. Kaminsky's son Jakub, who was only 17 but insisted on coming, and 9 others whose names Margaret had learned to forget immediately after hearing them. Anonymity was protection in the resistance. If you were captured, you couldn't betray people you didn't know. They had 2 rifles between them, old hunting weapons that might fire if God was feeling generous. Everyone else was armed with whatever they could find: axes, kitchen knives, tire irons. Against 4 German soldiers with military-grade weapons. They were criminally under-equipped, but they had surprise. They had desperation. And they had Margaret's intelligence about exactly when and where the convoy would pass. They waited in the forest, in among the trees, barely breathing as the morning wore on. Margaret's hands shook despite the warmth of the day. She had never hurt another person in her life. She had been trained to teach, to nurture, to help children grow. Now she was crouched in the forest preparing to attack soldiers. At 10:43 a.m., they heard the sound of engines approaching. Stefan raised his hand, signaling. Everyone tensed. The convoy came around the bend. A lead car with 4 soldiers visible inside, then 2 large trucks covered with tarps. The vehicles slowed as they approached the felled tree blocking the road. The lead car stopped. Soldiers emerged, rifles ready, surveying the obstacle with suspicion. Now, Stefan whispered, and Margaret Kozlowski, mathematics teacher, stepped out from behind a tree and into a war that would change her forever. The moment between peace and violence is so thin you can slip through it without realizing you've crossed. 1 second, Margaret was a teacher hiding behind a tree. The next, she was running toward an armed German soldier, screaming in Polish, waving her arms like a madwoman. This was her role in the plan: distraction. The Germans would see a hysterical woman, probably a local villager, and their attention would focus on her while the rest of the resistance moved into position. It relied entirely on the assumption that German soldiers wouldn't immediately shoot a civilian woman. Margaret prayed that assumption was correct. "Help! Please help!" she screamed in Polish, stumbling toward the soldiers. "My husband! There's been an accident. He's trapped." The 4 soldiers spun toward her, rifles raising. Margaret's entire body went cold with terror, but she kept running, kept screaming, kept playing the role of a desperate woman who didn't notice she was approaching armed men. One of the soldiers, the commander, judging by his insignia, barked something in German. Margaret didn't need to understand the words to know what he was saying. "Stop, or I'll shoot." She stopped, panting, hands raised, tears streaming down her face. The tears were real, born from pure terror, but they served the performance perfectly. "My husband," she gasped in broken German. "Tractor accident. Leg crushed. Need doctor. Please." The commander lowered his rifle slightly, his expression shifting from threat assessment to annoyance. Just what he needed. A crying Polish peasant interrupting a supply convoy. He said something to the soldier beside him, probably ordering him to deal with her while they cleared the road. That moment of distraction was all the resistance needed. Stefan and 3 others emerged from the tree line behind the convoy, moving fast and quiet. They reached the rear truck before the soldiers noticed, climbing into the cab while the Germans were focused on Margaret. But the driver of the second truck saw them. He shouted a warning, and everything dissolved into chaos. The German commander spun toward the trucks, rifle snapping up. He fired. A sharp crack that echoed through the forest, and Stefan dropped to the ground. Margaret screamed, not for performance this time, but because Stefan was hit. Oh, God, he was hit and bleeding. Pyotr appeared from the forest with one of their hunting rifles. He fired back, the old weapon bucking in his hands. The shot went wide, but it made the Germans dive for cover behind their vehicles. More resistance members emerged, converging on the trucks. The air filled with gunfire. Sporadic, chaotic, the sound of people who weren't soldiers trying to fight people who were. Margaret ran, not away from the fight, but toward Stefan, who was lying in the dirt, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and too much, way too much blood. Go! Stefan gasped when Margaret reached him. Get the trucks. You're shot. I know I'm shot. Get the trucks. A bullet hit the tree beside Margaret's head, bark exploding. She threw herself flat, covering Stefan's body with her own on pure instinct. When she looked up, she saw young Jakob running toward the first truck, saw him reach for the door handle. The German commander shot him. Center mass, point-blank range. Jakob was dead before he hit the ground. Something inside Margaret broke in that moment. Not broke into pieces, but broke like a dam breaks, releasing something that had been held back by civility and morality and all the rules that govern decent human behavior. She had never killed anyone. She had never even hit another person in anger. But she looked at Jakob's body, 17 years old, dead in the dirt because he believed in freedom, and she wanted these German soldiers dead with an intensity that felt like religious fervor. Margaret grabbed the tire iron that had fallen from Stefan's hand. She stood up, and she ran at the German commander with a sound coming from her throat that wasn't quite human. He saw her coming, raised his rifle, fired. The bullet missed. Maybe his aim was off. Maybe God himself reached down and deflected it. Margaret didn't know and didn't care. She reached him before he could fire again, and she swung the tire iron with every ounce of strength in her teacher's body. It connected with his wrist. Bone cracked. The rifle fell. The commander stared at her in shock, this Polish woman who had appeared from nowhere and just broke his wrist with a tire iron. And in that moment of hesitation, Margaret hit him again, across the temple. Hard. He went down. Margaret stood over him. Tire iron raised for another blow, and realized with distant horror that she was fully prepared to kill this man. Would kill him. Wanted to kill him if he moved. He didn't move. Blood trickled from his temple. Unconscious, maybe dead, Margaret didn't check. Around her, the fight was turning. The resistance outnumbered the Germans, and desperation made them fierce. Pyotr had tackled one soldier and was beating him with his fists. 2 others had cornered the remaining Germans, who dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. It was over in less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like hours. 3 minutes that left Jakob dead, Stefan bleeding, one German commander unconscious, and Margaret Kozlowski's hands shaking so hard she dropped the tire iron. The trucks, she heard herself say. We need to take the trucks. Her voice sounded strange, flat, emotionless, like someone else was speaking through her mouth. Pyotr and 2 others who knew how to drive scrambled into the cabs of both trucks. The engines roared to life. Margaret helped get Stefan into the back of one truck, pressing cloth against his shoulder wound, telling him he would be fine even though she had no idea if that was true. The soldiers, Stefan gasped. You can't leave them. We're not, Margaret said, surprised by the coldness in her own voice. We're taking them with us. They tied up the 2 surrendering Germans and threw them in the back of the second truck. The unconscious commander they left beside the road with his fallen rifle. If he lived, he could walk back to Auschwitz and report what happened. If he died, well, that was one less Nazi in Poland. Margaret didn't feel guilty about that ambivalence. That's what scared her most. They drove the trucks deep into the forest, following paths that barely qualified as roads, until they reached a clearing that the resistance had prepared weeks ago. Here, they would unload the ammunition, hide it, and burn the trucks to destroy evidence. As they worked unloading crate after crate of rifle ammunition, pistol rounds, and even some grenades, Margaret realized what they had accomplished. This wasn't just a successful raid. This was a genuine military operation. They had attacked a German convoy, killed or captured soldiers, and stolen enough ammunition to supply a small army. The Germans would respond with fury. They would round up suspects. They would execute hostages. They would turn Oswiecim upside down, looking for the people responsible. And Margaret had been right in the center of it. She had attacked a German officer. She might have killed him. She still didn't know, didn't let herself think about it too much. "You saved my life," Stefan said that evening, after a resistance doctor had patched up his shoulder wound. "That commander was about to finish me off when you hit him." "I didn't think," Margaret admitted. "I just reacted." That's what combat is. Reaction, instinct, no time for philosophy. He studied her face. "You did good today. Better than good. You were brave." "I was terrified." Brave and terrified aren't opposites. They're the same thing happening simultaneously. Stefan gripped her hand with his uninjured arm. "But you need to understand, this changes everything. The Germans will be hunting us now. Really hunting us. They'll kill anyone they even suspect was involved. You need to be careful." Margaret nodded, but she was only half listening. She was thinking about Jakob, 17 years old, dead because he wanted to fight back. She was thinking about the German commander's skull under her tire iron. She was thinking about how easy it had been to cross that line from teacher to killer. "I need to get home," she said quietly. "Zofia will be worried." She walked back to Oswiecim as the sun set, following back roads and staying away from checkpoints. Her hands were scraped and bruised. Her dress was dirty. There was blood under her fingernails, Stefan's or the Germans'. She didn't know. When she finally reached her apartment, Zofia was awake, sitting by the window in the growing dark. "You're late," the little girl said. "I was scared." "I'm sorry, sweet one." Margaret pulled Zofia into a hug, breathing in the smell of her hair. Soap and childhood and innocence. "I'm here now. Everything's all right." But everything wasn't all right. As Margaret tucked Zofia into bed and sat by the window watching the street below, she saw German trucks rolling through town, more soldiers than usual. They were already starting the search. The reprisals began the next morning. The Nazis arrested 20 men at random from the district near where the ambush had occurred. The charges were posted on walls throughout Oswiecim: conspiracy against the Reich, banditry, murder of German soldiers. They were executed that afternoon in the town square. 20 men, lined up against a wall, shot while the entire town was forced to watch. Margaret stood in the crowd with her students around her, all of them required to attend by Nazi decree. She watched those men die and knew it was because of what she had done. These 20 innocent people, a baker, a postal worker, a grandfather who could barely walk, they were dead because the resistance had attacked that convoy. Because she had attacked that convoy. "Miss Kozlowski," whispered Sarah, one of her students, "why are they killing those men?" "What did they do?" "Nothing," Margaret said, and her voice didn't shake even though her hands did. "They did nothing at all. That's the point. The Germans want us to be afraid." "Are you afraid?" Margaret looked at Sarah's young face, at the fear and confusion there, and she made a decision. Fear was contagious, but so was courage. These children needed to see someone who wasn't afraid, even if it was a performance. "No," Margaret lied. "I'm not afraid of bullies, even bullies with guns. And you shouldn't be either." That evening, she returned to the church basement where the resistance was in chaos. 3 members had been arrested. The Nazis were conducting house-to-house searches in some districts. Everyone was terrified. "We need to stop operations," someone was saying. "Go to ground. They're too alert right now." "No," Margaret said, and everyone turned to look at her. "We don't stop. Stopping means they win. It means Jakob died for nothing. It means those 20 men this afternoon died for nothing. Margaret, Mrs. Kaminsky began. They want us afraid, Margaret continued, her voice getting stronger. They killed 20 innocent people today, specifically to make us afraid. If we stop, if we hide, we're giving them exactly what they want. We're letting terror work. So what do you suggest? Pyotr asked. We just continue like nothing happened? No, we escalate. Margaret pulled out the map they had used to plan the convoy ambush. We hit them again. Soon, before they expect it. We show them that killing hostages doesn't stop resistance. It creates more resistors. Stefan, his arm in a sling, was nodding slowly. She's right. The worst thing we can do now is pause. It signals that execution's work as deterrence. We also need to be smarter, Margaret added. The convoy ambush was successful but sloppy. We lost Jakob. Stefan was wounded. The Germans captured 2 of our operation members alive. Next time, we need to be cleaner, faster. We need to be ghosts. They never see us coming, never catch us, never even know who we are. How do we do that? Someone asked. Margaret looked around the room at these ordinary people who had become extraordinary through necessity. Shopkeepers and housewives and laborers who were now insurgents fighting the most powerful military machine in Europe. We stop thinking like civilians, she said. We start thinking like soldiers. And we use the one advantage we have. They don't take us seriously. They think we're just a nuisance, a gang of thugs. They don't realize we're at war. The debate continued for hours, but eventually the resistance agreed. They would continue operations, more carefully, more professionally, but they would continue. The guard examined her papers with the bored thoroughness of someone who had checked thousands of documents. Margaret's heart hammered. If he noticed anything wrong, a misspelled word, an incorrect stamp, a signature that didn't quite match, she would never leave this place alive. Wait here, the guard finally said, and disappeared into a guardhouse to make a phone call. Margaret waited, practicing controlled breathing, reminding herself that Greta Hoffman would not be nervous. Greta Hoffman was a German official with proper credentials conducting approved research. Greta Hoffman belonged here. The guard returned. Someone will escort you to the administration building. Do not deviate from the designated path. Do not photograph anything. Do not speak to prisoners. Understood? Naturally, Margaret said with just a hint of offended dignity, as if a Reich Ministry representative would do anything so unprofessional. An SS officer named Schmidt arrived to escort her. He was young, maybe 25, with the eager efficiency of someone trying to impress his superiors. As they walked to the camp, he explained the facility's purpose with disturbing pride. We can house 10,000 prisoners currently, with expansion plans for 30,000. They work in various industries, armaments, agriculture, construction. The commandant has implemented an excellent efficiency system. Prisoners who work hard receive additional rations. Those who don't, well, the system is self-correcting. Margaret nodded, taking mental notes while maintaining Greta's expression of professional interest. What she was seeing made her physically ill, but she couldn't show it. Greta Hoffman would be impressed by German efficiency, not horrified by human suffering. The prisoners were walking skeletons, literally. Skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken, moving with the mechanical slowness of bodies that had nothing left to burn but themselves. They wore striped uniforms that hung on their frames like cloth on scarecrows. Many had visible wounds, infected sores, swollen joints from malnutrition. What is the average attrition rate? Margaret asked, using the German euphemism for death. Schmidt consulted a notebook. Approximately 12% per month, though it varies by prisoner category. Jews and Soviets have higher rates. Political prisoners are more resilient. 12% per month. Margaret did the math instantly. At that rate, half the prison population would be dead within 6 months. This wasn't a labor camp. It was a death camp that happened to squeeze work out of people before they died. And expansion plans? Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the horror. Classified, I'm afraid. But I can tell you we're preparing for significantly larger operations. The Fuhrer has plans for the East that will require extensive facilities. The tour continued for 2 hours. Schmidt showed her workshops where prisoners made uniforms and boots, fields where they grew crops they weren't allowed to eat, punishment cells where people were locked in spaces so small they couldn't sit or stand, only crouch in darkness until they died or went mad. And Margaret, playing Greta Hoffman, nodded and took notes and asked questions about efficiency and productivity, as if she were touring a factory rather than a monument to human cruelty. When the tour ended, Schmidt walked her back to the gate. Will your report recommend our methods for other facilities? I'll need to analyze the data, Margaret said carefully. But your operation is certainly impressive in its scale and organization. Schmidt beamed. He had no idea he had just given a complete intelligence briefing to a Polish resistance operative. Margaret walked away from Auschwitz on legs that shook so badly she had to stop twice to steady herself. She made it 3 blocks before she vomited into an alley, her body purging the horror her mind couldn't process. That night, she reported everything to resistance: the camp's capacity, the death rate, the expansion plans, the prisoner categories, the guard rotation she had observed, the locations of vulnerable points in the security perimeter. They're planning something bigger, she concluded. Schmidt wouldn't say what, but the way he talked about extensive facilities and plans for the East, they're going to kill people. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. That camp is being built to murder on an industrial scale. The room was silent as everyone processed this. Finally, Stefan spoke. Then we have to stop it, or at least slow it down. If we can disrupt their operations, delay the expansion, maybe we save some lives. How? Pyotr asked. We can't attack that place directly. It's a fortress. No, Margaret agreed. But we can attack their supply lines. Everything that camp needs, food, building materials, fuel, ammunition, it all comes from somewhere. If we can intercept enough of those supplies, we can delay the expansion, make it harder for them to operate, turn their efficiency against them. Over the next 3 months, the resistance launched a coordinated campaign against Auschwitz's supply chain.